What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Healing Sucks podcast. It is getting hard for me to remember that I have a new name to my podcast now. So, you guys are going to be so excited. I have someone on the podcast today that has not been on yet, and we have Andrew Robinson on the podcast today. He is an ADHD certified clinical service provider. He also has a master's in social work, and he's a licensed clinical social worker. Andrew was diagnosed with ADHD when he was 3 years old after being kicked out of Montessori. He will explain to all of you guys what that class is because I actually had to ask him what it was myself. So don't feel bad if you don't know what that is. His own experiences of feeling different inspired him to want to help others not feel that way. He went on to get his master's in social work and started working to help those who also struggle with ADHD. Andrew works to create dialogue around the struggles that come from living with ADHD through his social media and strives to help the world be a more inclusive place for those who live with ADHD. Andrew, welcome to the Healing Six podcast. How are you?
I am great. I'm so excited to be here. I know we've been playing like a little bit of schedule tag for a while, and my
Yeah,
own ADHD has made me such a fun person to schedule, but I'm so glad to be here and I'm so excited to get this opportunity to talk to you and your audience about everything ADHD. This will be fun. I'm excited.
I know. I absolutely love your energy and the content that you put out on social media. I was looking around everywhere for a doctor or a therapist, somebody that could come on and really talk about ADHD and give facts, and came across your TikToks. And I was just like, this is the guy. Your energy is just so good, dude. And I feel like people are just like, attracted to that.
Well, I appreciate that, right? Because I think having ADHD and being someone who wants to share information about it's all about how you put it out there, right? And I think that for me, being able to dialogue about something that I care about so much, which I think shows in the way that I create my content, it's fun for me. Like this is a hobby for me to talk about ADHD. I love to talk about it. And I'm just so glad that you reached out and were able to like have this conversation. It's gonna be a lot of fun.
This is going to be so much fun. I'm so excited. Yeah, I think
Hmm.
it's really important to have a good energy about yourself when you're talking about any diagnoses because people really struggle with that, and it really bothers their self-esteem and just how they carry themselves as a person. So if you can have good fun energy educating people about a hard topic, I feel like it just really lifts the mood in the room and it helps others be able to be like, oh, okay, yes, I have that, and I don't need to be ashamed of it. Or that's what I've been living with. No one, I've been so hard on my roommate, but maybe they just have ADHD.
And that's the thing. There is so much misinformation, stigma, something I've grown up with, something I lived my whole life trying to combat and really just not play into is there's just stigma about the diagnosis. There's stigma about what it means to have ADHD. So when people hear it, it's either, oh my God, that's a made up disorder. You don't have that, or this is something horrible and I don't want to struggle with it. So I do my best through my platform to really try and tell people what ADHD is. Plain facts, it is what it is. It's not a curse, it's not a blessing. It's a mix of both. And it's just important to understand what it is that disorder means and how to best manage it to live a life that makes sense for you. Whether you believe in it or not, it's there.
Right. I love that. So, Andrew, I would like for you to tell the listeners and me your backstory, what it was like growing up with a
Yeah.
kid. With a kid. What was it like growing up with a kid? What was it growing up as a kid with ADHD? And what age were you diagnosed? How were you struggling before? And how did it affect you when you found out about it?
Yeah, so I don't really remember a life where I didn't know I had ADHD. I was diagnosed when I was 3 years old. I used to, the funny thing, I was on a podcast and I was telling people it was when I was 6. I very recently found out that was not the case. I was diagnosed when I was 3 after my mom told me I was kicked out of my, I know, right? My mom's like, no, you weren't diagnosed when you were 6. You were diagnosed when you were 3. You were kicked out of a Montessori. So A Montessori is, yeah, I don't remember it because I was never there, like old enough to register it. But a Montessori is it's a school where your play is your learning. So everything you're doing, it's just you learn as you play. So it's a hands-on learning environment for kids. It's very playing into their own strengths. It's a very free-for-all environment that I was too hyper for. So the teachers are like, he cannot come back here unless he is treated and medicated for ADHD. And this is in the 1990s. I was very fortunate. I had a very textbook case of ADHD, so it was very easy for them to diagnose me. um, Growing up with ADHD was a lot of internalized stigma because I always knew I was different. I always felt like I was different. I had trouble connecting with my peers as I got older. When I was younger, it didn't really bother me, but as I got like into my later years in grade school, it started to get a lot harder because I just wasn't connecting, right? There were social cues and social differences that I had trouble picking up on. I know it's not autism. I was assessed for autism. It's not autism. But there's some of those social cues that, people with ADHD will struggle with because we're developmentally behind by a few years, typically 2 to 3 years on average. So we have more trouble connecting with our peers. That continued to persist through middle school and through high school. Um, and until I was out of, like, in college, I started finding my own. I started falling in love with psychology. I started really trying to understand what ADHD is. I was in and out of therapy my whole life, and I really am like, what is ADHD? Got into therapy because I just really love psychology. Go figure, you spend your whole life in front of a therapist. You're going to probably like the field of psychology because it's fascinating. And oh, it just became something that was naturally interesting to me. So that passion really took me through grad school. It took me into my practice. And eventually I was realizing, like, yeah, I knew I always wanted to treat ADHD in some capacity. I kind of wound around to get there. So I took different paths. I went into different career options. Eventually I found my way into therapy. I realized there's a very lack of support for adults with ADHD. So that's what I wanted to do. I started helping and treating adults with ADHD. So for me, my own personal struggle, my own personal feelings of not having support, and then becoming an adult and also trying to manage everything that childhood doesn't really prepare you for, it was kind of that whirlwind. And I think that passion of wanting to understand myself and wanting to help other people is really what led me to do what I'm doing. So, I guess in a roundabout way, my own struggles made me want to help other people not feel those same feelings of isolation, disconnect, and loneliness that we tend to feel as people with ADHD.
I did the same thing. I became an esthetician in my 20s because I had major skincare problems for like 2 years and I couldn't figure it out. And then now I'm back in college for psychology, becoming a therapist myself because of all the mental health issues that I have. And I always knew something was wrong, but I didn't have any diagnoses until uh, 18. I was diagnosed with MDD and generalized anxiety, but it was just a general practitioner and he just kind of threw me medication and didn't give me any education on it at all. I went on and off my meds from the time I was 18 till I was mid 30s. And now I'm 37 and I've been on my medication steady since 2020. Going through that myself and what a struggle it was from just not knowing and not having people around me that should have told me, hey, you should go get assessed by a psychiatrist. You should do this, you should do that. And I know that these people came from a really good place, but they would give me their own thoughts and opinions. And that didn't help me out at all. I had real mental health issues that I needed a doctor to address. And obviously, I don't think anything bad about them. I know I've given people wrong information before because I just was not educated and I wanted to help someone. But I think it's so important for us to recognize when someone's struggling with something that you can't really understand, for them to say, you know what, I'm here, I love you, I support you, but I don't have the right information for you, and I think you need to see a specialist. There's nothing wrong with that.
Well, I think
So,
that's just such a
yeah.
big highlight between the difference in privilege, right? As a straight white guy, it's a lot easier for a fidgety little white kid to get diagnosed with ADHD. The average age for women to get diagnosed with ADHD is in the mid 30s because of exactly what you're saying. People don't take you as seriously as they take someone like me. That is an inherent problem with the way ADHD is. There's a reason why 75% of people with ADHD have not received proper diagnosis. It's stories just like the one you're describing. Plus, how are you going to give someone a reason to buy into medication if they don't see the necessity for it?
Yeah, exactly. So I don't want to be someone that hands out false education, and I wanted to be educated enough to, number one, discover myself and who I am on a deeper level, and to give out real information, real facts that I'm getting from a university instead of just by ear,
Mhm,
by hearing, or people what people post all over social media. Because if they're not a doctor, they're not a therapist, then it could be very false
mhm,
information. And I even still see some therapists that post false information.
mhm,
I don't know. You just really have to find the right people to talk to. And you'll normally see that because they'll have people that back them up. They'll have good reviews. People will be like, I actually got help from this, you know?
mhm. Oh yeah. And that's the thing, right? Like there's some such outdated views. I've heard stories of people telling me, yeah, I went to a doctor and they said women can't have ADHD. Only little boys can have it. I've had people tell me that they're told they're too smart to have ADHD. They're too successful to have ADHD. There's a lot of stigma and misinformation that even professionals hold, and it's important that we have dialogues like this in order to continue to challenge that stigma, to challenge that misinformation, so people aren't afraid to get help for the things that are truly important to them and truly matter to them. And so they don't have to waste years thinking they're inherently flawed or inherently broken. And that's why we have these conversations. That's why I post on social media to make sure people don't feel alone.
Yeah, same. So now that we're on the topic of false stigmas, let's run through some of them.
Yeah, I mean, so I think a lot of it leans into some of the old narratives of what we used to understand ADHD is. So let's break down, I think a good way to do it. Let's break down what ADHD is and what it isn't. So ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So, what that means is it's something that you're born with. It's not something that you acquire, it's something that you're born with. So, per the Diagnosis and Statistic Manual, which we could have a whole separate conversation of some of the inherent flaws with it in and of itself, but per the Diagnosis and Statistic Manual, there are three subtypes that can exist of ADHD: attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, predominantly inattentive type. So this is the subtype that is typically seen in women. So this is the daydreamer, the person who's aloof, the person who's kind of there but isn't. It's you have trouble focusing is the big thing. Um, and so this is what we used to refer to as ADD, which is no longer a diagnosis because we now understand that even if you don't have external hyperactivity, the racing mind, the racing thought, those are how ADHD symptoms are internalized. So ADD no longer exists. People will still use the term, but it does not exist per the Diagnosis and Statistics Manual. There's two other subtypes: the hyperactive and impulsive subtype, which is the classic symptoms. You're hyper, you're fidgety, you're squirmy, you you can't control your thoughts or action or your words or your actions, you're blurting things out. Those are the symptoms that would exist without the daydreaming, the inattentiveness in that subtype. So this one is very rarely diagnosed because very rarely do you strictly have hyperactive impulsivity, hyperactive slash impulsive symptoms without inattentive symptoms. It can happen. I've personally never diagnosed it. I personally don't see it very often. It does exist. That's there for a reason. The third subtype is the combined subtype. So that's me. That you see that one, that's probably the more common one too, but that's where you have all three sets of symptoms: hyperactivity, inattentiveness, and impulsivity. So generally speaking, those are the three ways ADHD presents. Now, there's some people who will say that there's different types there's not really any evidence that exists to support that. Like, for example, Dr. Amen has proposed 7 subtypes of ADHD. Most of the mainstay research does not back that. So that's ADHD in and of itself. Now, to break down some of the stigma that exists there, um, is I think like one of the big ones is that we're pushing kids to get hooked on pills. I hear that one a lot. Medication is one of the most effective and safe ways that we can treat ADHD. It has the most evidence behind it. Outside of working out consistently, there is not really much better treatment you can get to manage and regulate dopamine and norepinephrine, the two neurotransmitters that are thought to be associated with ADHD. We're not pushing people to get hooked on pills. We are not doing it because we're addicted. It actually lowers the rate of addiction. Some of the most stigma that I hear around ADHD and misinformation tends to center around the use of medication. That's a big one. The other piece, another stigma, is that it's a modern disorder. It's a made up disorder. We're just doing it to, again, get kids hooked on pills. We have known about the symptom cluster that is ADHD since the late 1700s, since Sir Alexander Crichton published it. He said it was a deficit of moral something. Can't remember the last word of that, but it was a deficit of moral whatever. And so we've been talking about this symptom cluster since the late 1770s. We're not pushing kids to get hooked on pills. It is not some modern disorder. We've known about this for centuries. The last stigma, the last piece of misinformation that I tend to hear a lot is that it's overdiagnosed, right? We're saying that people are overdiagnosed. And so my response to that is twofold. Any mental health condition, any mental health disorder can be misdiagnosed. It's not a perfect science. There is room for error. As we said, 75% of people have not received proper diagnosis. It's underdiagnosed because we've only captured people like me historically, and the diagnosis criterion is historically wrapped around people like me. So rather than saying it's overdiagnosed, I would say it's woefully underdiagnosed, and the diagnosis criterion needs to be updated. I could probably keep rambling for the rest of our time together, but I'm gonna pause so I can give you some room to also interject a bit.
Yeah, you're fine. So do you think that in any way, because I do agree that the medication helps, I really haven't seen another way that has really been beneficial if you have ADHD. Do you think that children that go on high dosages of things like Adderall or Ritalin, um, do you think that during their developmental stages this could hinder a certain part of their development or no?
So the main thing that people have brought up, the biggest concern is the growth, like height wise, inches. We're talking maybe inches is the most evidence that I've seen. Beyond that, developmentally, no. So, in fact, longitudinal data has shown that it normalizes development because, as we talked about, the maturation of an ADHD brain is typically 2 to 3 years behind. Ethically speaking, we can't really do any like true studies on how ADHD would affect it in that way. Because ethically speaking, it would be like a study could not be designed around that because giving one group that and the other group not that would be ethically irresponsible. So, generally speaking, what we've seen, if there was data that would support that it has a significant impact on development, it would be around, right? As someone who's been on medication since he was 6 years old, which is when I used to think I was diagnosed, but nope, that's just when I've been medicated from. I've not had any developmental delays. In fact, I would not be where I am without the medication that I took. I've been on methylphenidate products, but I think it's also an important thing to discuss, generally speaking, the different classes of medication that are available to
Mm-hmm.
people with ADHD. So there's three, generally speaking. There's stimulants, which include the methylphenidate groups and the amphetamine based groups, which is where you find. So amphetamines include Adderall, Vyvanse, things of that nature. Methylphenidate groups include Ritalin, Concerta, things of that nature. Those are the psychostimulants that will increase and help regulate the production of dopamine and norepinephrine. Those are the psychostimulants. They work until they're out of your system and then they're gone. The non-stimulants includes SNRIs, which include Strattera and Quellbry. Those specifically act on norepinephrine. So those more act similarly to an antidepressant, but they don't have the stimulant side effects. They're safer in that kind of less side effect profile for people. I love SNRIs personally. Those have helped me significantly. The last class is they're called alpha 2 agonists. They're antihypertensive medications. And so those include clonidine and guanfacine. And those are going to help more with the emotional dysregulation piece because they're going to calm and lower agitation, which as a result frees up more room for focus and symptom improvement, right? Those are usually paired with something else like an SNRI or a stimulant, but they're really helpful at managing symptoms. Then there's other like atypical ones that have been used. We've heard Wellbutrin. There's memantine, which is a dementia medication. So there's a lot of alternative treatments. The main thing is ADHD of any mental health condition has the most options for medication and the best options for medication too, for managing symptoms. So when it comes to managing, like, is it going to affect growth? I've never seen anything that says that will impair or inhibit development. But it is an important consideration. And if you are concerned about it, I definitely think you should talk to your child's doctor and preferably one that knows a thing or two about ADHD.
Yeah, do your research, right? Don't just
Right?
go talk to
Right?
one, talk to
Look up your
several
doc.
of them. Like,
Yeah.
stalk them like you would do your next boyfriend. I
Right.
would.
If they're on Tinder, then you should probably find a new one.
Yeah, exactly. For sure, for sure. No, thank you. Next. Um,
Left.
what are some of the things that come along with people that are not medicated? They're not balancing their ADHD or managing it well at all. We see things like addiction problems, right? Because we're always like
Mhm.
searching for that dopamine hit. And so I'm sure that can show up in like a million different ways, like crazy spending or but can you kind of go over the gist of that?
Oh, yeah. So untreated ADHD, let's be frank here. It can lower a life expectancy up to 13 years. It's not a joke to not manage your ADHD. So addiction, 50% of people with a substance use disorder also have ADHD. People with ADHD have more likelihood to develop addiction, and it typically comes from a form of self-medication. It's either I don't want to experience these symptoms, so I'm going to mask them by using substances, or I'm getting symptom relief by using these substances. Nicotine is a big one, but we also see it a lot with alcohol and marijuana as well. Marijuana is probably the most, as a therapist, one that I see probably the most often because it calms everything down for people. So substance use, very common. But there's also a lot of risk-taking behaviors that come with having ADHD. Unsafe sex, you can get more likely to be in a traumatic situation as people with ADHD are 4 times more likely to develop a trauma disorder. You are more likely to mismanage or struggle to manage routine healthcare. So you're more likely to develop illness over time, impulsive spending, impulsive shopping habits. We're more likely to do that. Risky driving. We're more likely to get into accidents and have a higher rate of accidents. So the behaviors of unmanaged ADHD, diagnosed or undiagnosed, can be incredibly dangerous. So it's important, like when I say that a diagnosis can save someone's life, it can save someone's life. It can help manage healthcare. It can help manage some of these impulsive and risky decisions that people are making. But to kind of sum it up, yeah, it's really risky not to manage your ADHD.
Yeah, it is. I have all that with myself, and I'm not on medication that I should be taking for ADHD, but what I am taking is managing it for me. I don't know if that makes any sense or not. It's I
It
just have
does.
some. I'm just on like an SSRI. I'm on Prozac, and then I do my low dose ketamine treatments.
Hmm.
I think the ketamine has really helped, but so did the Prozac because I had major depressive disorder, generalized anxiety on top of ADHD. I was a crap show. What the heck was going on for a long time? I didn't start getting really balanced until about a year and a half ago when I started low dose ketamine, and I've stayed consistent on my mental health meds. I did all the things that you were talking about. I self medicated, not because
Mhm.
I enjoyed getting high. I never enjoyed getting high, but it made me feel normal. I felt normal whenever I did self medicate. Getting on the right medication 100% has done away with all of that. I've had no problems. Don't even think about it anymore. That's in my past. But it's really hard for us to move forward in life because society looks at someone who's using drugs and goes, "Oh, well, they just like getting high." They don't want to take responsibility
Mhm.
for their lives, and there's so much that can be going on with mental disorders. They're just unbalanced, or they just need to be medicated or on the right stuff. They need a therapist. They need love and support, not fingers pointed at. And that's what I love about
Yeah.
my podcast. A lot of people on my podcast struggled with addiction. They've all been through trauma and abuse. Most of them deal with the same mental health disorders that I do, if not some more. So we're all on the same healing journey here. And I feel like this information is so powerful for everyone to get.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing, right? There's no one right way to treat it. Any any mental health condition is specific to the individual. We have to find our own way through our mental health. Whether that's with medication, lifestyle changes, or something completely different, we are the only people living our own life. No one else is going to know what's going to work best for us. And so the sooner we start accepting that, the sooner we can start our own healing journey. And that was something I struggled with. Like especially in college, I struggled a lot with like self-medication. I went to college, I joined a fraternity, I got nicknamed based on how messed up I would get, right? I was noticed because of that, right? Like and because I wanted to fit in, I thought it was just easier to do that. It made me feel like I was more relaxed, more connected, and more socially engaged wasn't. It was just a way for me to unmask. And so I think it's understanding that for me, stepping away from that and understanding who I am, managing my own self care, connecting with myself in that way, that's what allowed me to really engage in my own healing journey. But understanding that's also a part of who I am. I struggle with addictive personality tendencies, and I go all in when I go on those things. So it's understanding what your own hail, for lack of a better word, to heal is going to be, and committing to that. That's how anyone heals, ADHD or otherwise.
Yeah, and it's a struggle because I can sit here and tell you all day long what works for me, and it may not work at all
Hmm.
for someone else. And I think that's part of the journey of finding out who you are, because I know forever I was like screaming from the inside. Someone save me, someone give me answers, someone come do this for me. This is too much for me, when all I had to do was spend some time with me, get to know me, which terrified me at the time because I knew I had a lot of stuff up here that just was sitting like dormant, just waiting to be reopened. And it was hard. Healing is hard. Figuring out who you are and being like, okay, this is who I am, and maybe it's not all that pretty, but we can change that. Going in with a positive outlook, knowing that you're not the only one on this journey, knowing that there's so many other people fighting the same battle and talking about it openly to help other people resonate and know, hey, even if it's a voice through my phone, like I'm not alone. That's so powerful to me because like I said before, I was terrified to try to figure out who I was so that I could help myself on all aspects.
And that's why challenging stigma is so important, right? Because of stigma around mental health, around ADHD, around managing our own internal environment, that stigma prevents people from getting the help that they need. I should be able to, I don't know, pull myself up by my bootstraps and do it myself. When in reality, it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to try and do things on your own timeline in your own way. There's no right or wrong way to do it. It's just knowing what works for yourself and challenging that stigma for me as a content creator is why I do it. Because I don't want people to feel like, oh, someone's gonna judge me or, oh, I'm dealing with something that's incredibly weird. I felt that. I have felt alone. I have felt like no one will understand me. No one should have to feel like that. And if I could at least help one person by doing the content that I'm making, then I've done enough. And that's really what it's about, making a difference in people's lives. That's why I do what I do. I like to help people. I became a therapist because I truly think that making the world better than you found it is why we're all here. And if I can do that by having these conversations, by creating content, by being a therapist, then I'm doing something right. And that feels good to me. I lean into what feels good to me, and that's what you should do in your own healing journey. Lean into what feels right. Listen to what feels right and go from there.
Yeah, I so agree with that. There's just a big beauty in that, into leaning into the quote unquote problem, which is really not a problem. You're not a problem. You didn't ask to be born like this, but now you're here. So it's your job to figure it out. It's a part
Mhm.
of the life journey that we all have. It just took me a long time to figure it out. It was like trying every other
Yeah,
path
but
but the
it's
healing
it's a
journey.
you know what they say, it's a marathon, not a sprint.
True, true. They do say that. So I'm interested. What are some of the most unrealistic things a client has come to you and been like, I think I have ADHD because I blank, or something they'll bring up and say, I don't have ADHD.
I'm not sure if I do. Because typically what I find is when people like I would say one time, there's been one time someone has come to me and I'm like, I'm really not sure if you have ADHD. Generally speaking, when people come to me questioning whether or not they have ADHD, they come by it after a lot of research, right? Very rarely am I gonna look at someone and be like, oh, you've researched it. I'm gonna disagree with you. Um, I've had people who will self-medicate and will swear by it, and I might question that based at like I've had
Okay.
people who are like, "Oh yeah, I'm self-medicating with marijuana. I feel great with it." And then they're getting irritable, angry, and they don't know why. It's like let's connect the pieces here. Chronic marijuana use will cause some emotional dysregulation. It's not going to manage your symptoms long term in a way that's going to be effective. If it works for you, great, but question it a little bit. But generally speaking, I think I trust people. I'm very trusting of the way that people will explore their journey. And I think when you come to therapy into a setting to where you want to continue to explore that, I will support you in every way possible. I'm open about the fact that I believe in self-diagnosis because very rarely are people doing it because they want like ADHD is funsies. Like nobody, this isn't something you sign up for because you think it's an enjoyable thing. Um, so yeah, generally speaking, I think people have a pretty good grasp on what their symptoms are and why they're experiencing.
Well, that's good to know because I feel like other doctors or therapists will be like, "You think you're so smart because you got on the internet and did some research." I've
Yeah,
literally had
I
had
mean,
doctors look at me and
yeah,
go, "Oh, really? Why do you think you have that?" And I'm like, "Can you just test me? I'm sorry. I'm just concerned about my health." Yeah.
that's the invalidating narrative that people get, right? Like I think that, great example. I had a client who, this is a little TMI, but we'll go through it. So I randomly got this rash. I went to my doctor and I said, why do I have this rash? They were saying it could have been an allergy, it could have been, right? They didn't doubt that I knew what was going on. I was working with a woman, same thing. Had a random rash, didn't know why. They told her it was anxiety. They told her it was stress hives. I have privilege. Some people don't. So I am not going to use my privilege to invalidate someone's lived experience. And I think that more providers need to understand that other people get told things just based on the way that they look, the gender that they are. And I don't support that in my space. And I think it's
Yeah.
unfair that other people have to have that struggle.
Yeah, I agree because a lot of people have already been to other doctors and had wrong diagnosis.
Hmm.
And so they come in and say, this provider thought that I had XYZ, and then they're made to feel like they're dumb or undereducated because of something that a different physician told them. Yeah, it's not fair at all.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, I've written letters on people's behalf to just say, hey, this isn't mental health, right? I can determine that the symptoms that I'm seeing could not be explained by mental health because even in the presence of these symptoms being managed by mental health, it's real. And the fact that I have to write a letter for someone to be believed, it just boggles my mind. Like, it's gross.
It is 100% gross. Okay, Andrew, I'm wondering, as a certified clinical service provider, what does a day's work look like for you? How do you treat your clients? What do you do?
Yeah, okay, let's talk about what therapy for ADHD looks like. So, I really focus on a few different modalities. I will explain them because I think it's important to understand why I choose them. So, the therapy modalities that I lean into include acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy, and then I do a lot of executive functioning training. There's a few more modalities that I eventually want to explore, but these are the ones that I lean into right now. So, acceptance and commitment therapy essentially tells us that we all have our own values. As people with ADHD, we tend to think that our values are less important to make someone else more comfortable. So it's the radical acceptance that our values are going to, they're it. Those are our values. Nobody else has to hold those values for us, and we accept that we're going to commit to acting on them. So I work with people to understand what their values are and deal with the intrusive thoughts that disalign from them and prevent them from committing to those values. Accepting ADHD involves that radical acceptance of I have certain values, and in order to manage and commit to accommodating my ADHD, I have to deal with some things that are going to be really, really uncomfortable. The other piece is dialectical behavioral therapy. So a lot of that teaches us how do we, number one, regulate from emotions that are too uncomfortable by using mindfulness and other regulation techniques. And how do we challenge those things that disalign from keeping us regulated in the moment, right? So it teaches us how to regulate our emotions and build safety enough to exist in uncomfortable emotions. While emotional dysregulation isn't a diagnosis criterion, 70% of people with ADHD experience emotional dysregulation, and it is an executive functioning. Self monitor, self regulation are two executive functions that can be impaired for people with ADHD. This is where you hear people talk about rejection sensitive dysphoria. This is where you hear people talk about like emotional flooding. So those are a lot of common experiences for people with ADHD. So I help people build safety in their emotions and learn coping skills and strategies to regulate when those emotions get a little bit too intense. The last thing I do is called executive functioning training. So part of that ADHD CCSP, certified clinical service provider training that I did talked a lot about executive functioning and how to create different ways to accommodate to it. So think life hacks here. This is where a lot of those life hacks will come in. So ADHD can also be considered a disorder of executive functioning because it impairs our ability to manage our basic executive functions, planning and prioritizing, impulse control, emotional regulation, things of that nature. So I teach people skills that'll help them really manage that. But it's therapy, right? I kind of follow the thread where it goes, and it can often be very different. A lot of times I deal with trauma too, as trauma and ADHD is very common. So I'm trained in internal family systems, which is a modality seen inside out, basically that concept, right? We all have different parts of ourselves, self, capital S, that will help guide and influence the decisions we make. They don't define us, but rather they guide ourselves in different decisions. And when we experience trauma, certain parts get exiled and they stop trusting ourselves to do things in a way that aligns with ourselves. So as a result, we have to work to heal those exiled parts and reconcile their relationship with that capital S self. Um, so a bit of trauma work, a lot of just connecting with different values, emotions, and executive function trainings is generally what I'll do. But there's
Nice.
also I write service animal letters, things like that.
Okay. That's nice. That's good to know. What state are you in?
I'm in Missouri.
Missouri. Okay.
Currently licensed in this. Yeah.
Are you, so can you only be like a therapist to clients that are in Missouri? So you don't do any like Zoom calls or anything like that?
Do Zoom. So I do offer virtual counseling, but it's exclusively in the state of Missouri. I'm working on getting my license in Illinois. Like I started that impulsively today. But yes, my licensing board only allows me to practice in the state that I'm licensed in because my licensing board manages it state by state. As much as I would love to expand to other states, it takes a lot of effort. Like you have to do background checks and pay money and bureaucracy.
Yeah, there's a lot to it. Like doctors, the same thing. That's why they can't prescribe in every state. A lot of them can't. They have to get licensed.
Hmm.
It's a lot of work.
Bingo.
You're like, bingo, that's why I
Yes.
don't want to do it. I hear you. Yeah, I don't know. That's a problem that I'm facing right now because I'm like, I probably need to switch schools. I don't know yet. I need to figure out where I'm going to like land. That way I don't get licensed in a state that I'm not even going to be going back to or living at.
Well,
So,
well, the thing is, I went to school in a different state where I practice. Like I moved before I got licensed. You can get licensed wherever you want. You just have to do whatever that state's licensing is. And once you sit for the exam, it's pretty easy to apply for reciprocity. Like in terms of just paying money and doing paperwork, that's kind of the only variable that comes into play. But beyond that, like you can like go in California, go to school in California, then move to New York and do the licensing exam and everything in New York, then move back to California and apply for reciprocity. But you'd have to pay a fee and all that good stuff, just as an example.
yeah. Yes, I know. Like you said, trouble, trouble, trouble. Lots of work. As if school wasn't already
Right.
enough work. Like, whatever. Um, but
Right.
so listeners, don't feel bad if you don't live in the state of Missouri and you're like, I want to go see Andrew. He, at least you can go follow him on social media because he gives out so much good information. You could flip through all of his content on TikTok and learn so much about ADHD, like stuff that I was just like, whoa, like I didn't expect that to be a part of ADHD, or actually that part of me that I thought was ADHD actually has nothing to do with ADHD at all because, undereducated on ADHD.
Whenever I make content, I really do my best to try and offer what I like, research it, right? So in the process of making content over the last, I started in July of 2023 making content. And I've learned so much just through the process of making content. I think in the last year, I've listened to 20 books about ADHD. Like, I'm very interested in the content. I research it, and it's important to me. And I think I really appreciate that you see that in my content because that's what I always hope to do is create content that people can learn from. You don't have to go through all these channels to get important information. I want it to be accessible, and that's why I do what I do. People have a right to know about this information. We're not gatekeeping. There's no right. There's no reason.
Yeah, no, not at all. So, do you have a book that you would recommend to someone who's trying to learn a little bit more about their ADHD and how to manage it? Or is,
Depends on what you're trying to learn, right? I just read a great book, ADHD for Smartass Women by Tracy Otsuka. That's a really great book for women with ADHD. I've read ADHD 2.0 by Doctors Hallowell and Rainey. It's a little more dense, but it focuses on the strength-based approach of handling ADHD. I've read ADHD is Awesome by the Holderness family. That's a fantastic book. That's more engaging if you're looking for something a little lighter. There's Extra Focus by Jesse Anderson, which is like a 2 hour listen, but it's like it just hits the ground running with coping skills and strategies. There's tons of books. And I think it's just knowing like what it is you're trying to learn about ADHD and the information is out there. There was an article published that I was featured in on oh geez, I forget the name of it. It's Selena Gomez's website, but it was 19 books for people with ADHD, and that list, I've read nearly every book on it, and I think that list is great. Like those kind of lists. If you look up uh, 19 books for people with ADHD, that would be the list I would reference for sure.
Nice. Yeah, thank you for that. I know I'm kind of throwing some questions at you that I wasn't really prepared to ask.
Yeah.
So
Squeaky wheel gets the oil. I had a supervisor tell me that.
I like that one actually. The squeaky wheel gets the oil. I like
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Um, we're getting towards the end of the podcast here, and I have a question to ask you before. I
Mhm.
often hear people on social media say that they have learned to use their ADHD as a superpower. Have you heard that? Can you give us some examples of how someone could use ADHD as a superpower?
Yeah, so let me first just address it because I've personally, even as a content creator, I've gone back and forth on this. When I first started, I very much leaned into the ADHD as a superpower. It's a way that I would recommend people talk to their kids. Now I pull that just a bit back. It's a gift that has a lot of drawbacks, but it can be a gift in certain ways. So hyper focus is probably the first thing that comes to mind for people, right? We have an ability when we're interested in something to really laser in. I also think that gives us an ability to do more work in a short amount of time. Like we can get a lot of work done in a very short amount of time when we're interested. We're also passion driven. That novelty seeking makes us very passionate. There's a reason I absorb so much content about ADHD myself. And there's a reason I'm so passionate about it in the way that I talk. It's because it means something to me. So those are like two just examples that I find for people with ADHD, and creativity is a big one. We're really good at coming up with ideas, but I think the main thing to understand though is that it can be very disabling for some people. So the idea of calling it a superpower can feel very alienating for people
Mm-hmm.
like that. So I usually say it has gifts, but that doesn't mean it's all sunshine and rainbows. So like understanding that we lean into our own personal strengths while managing the things that can be disabling. I'm a passionate person that could barely schedule this podcast. Like it's not always gonna be great. Like, and so it's just understanding that work with your strengths, outsource or get support or create systems for your deficit. But yeah, I think like fun fact, the reason we have mobile boarding passes is because someone with ADHD didn't want to wait in line. So he created them. The owner of JetBlue created mobile boarding passes for that reason. So we can lean into our strengths and even our deficits can have strength. It's just understanding your own cocktail and knowing yourself enough to learn that cocktail.
Absolutely love that because I've heard so many people be like, yeah, I have ADHD, but it's my superpower. Okay, what the F am I missing out on over here? Because mine is not a
Right?
superpower, like at all. Like, even if I get passionate about something, I still have other stuff going on, like MDD and my generalized anxiety that keep me literally paralyzed to my bed. So it's like I I really want to, but how am I gonna get there?
Right. Exactly. And that's why I've pulled back on that language myself. And that's why it's like it's important to recognize we don't want to alienate other people in the community by saying it's great because it's a privilege to have it as a superpower. For me, I was privileged to get support, so it can be a superpower. Not everybody is afforded the privileges of good support systems to make it that superpower. So it's important that we recognize that it can almost be a little ableist to say that it's only a superpower.
I agree. I'm gonna have you drop your socials. Let everybody know where they
Hmm.
can find you, Andrew, and I will
Sure.
link everything below in the show notes.
You can find me at Neurospicy Counseling on Instagram, TikTok, and Threads. I also have a great community on Discord. I have a whole link tree where you can find everything about me there. You can also go to that link tree if you're interested in scheduling a session with me. I have a little bit of a wait list, but I am taking new clients, exclusively virtual in the state of Missouri. I think that's everything that I got.
Perfect. And then I normally leave most of my podcasts with either saying a a quote, a positive quote or inspirational quote. But today I'm going to leave the podcast with something I think that people should get out of their vocabulary and stop saying, "You're too pretty for blank. You're too pretty to be abused. You're too pretty to have ADHD. You're too pretty to have someone cheat on you. You're too pretty to have anything bad happen to you at all." It is old as Moses to say that stuff, and it is very isolating. And also, you're telling people that have body dysmorphia and other diagnoses who don't think they're pretty, or people with just horrible insecurity problems, that they deserve abuse or they deserve all these things because they don't believe they're pretty. Beauty is subjective, y'all. Stop saying it.
And
Stop saying it. Do you have anything you just want to leave the
love it.
listeners with? It can be
Uh,
anything.
let me think. Let me think. No matter what anyone tells you, understand that your journey is your own, and you're gonna get there on your own time. Take all the time that you need to heal. Take all the time that you need to self-discover. Take all the time that you need to be the person that you want to be. There's no timeline. There's no race. You will get there when you get there.
Love that. Yes. Also, the person that made up timelines as far as where you're supposed to be at a certain age in life can go jump off the nearest bridge. You have really hurt a lot of people by coming up with that
Right.
idea. Also, when you jump off the bridge, I hope you just hit water and you're okay afterwards, but learn your lesson and go back and tell everybody you were wrong for making up
Yeah,
these timelines.
knock the wind out of yourself, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
right.
It's been such a pleasure having you on the Healing Sex podcast, Andrew. Have a wonderful evening.
Thanks, you too. It's been a pleasure.